Welcome to PolyTheism. My name is Justin.
And I'm Sandra.
And PolyTheism is a podcast at the intersection of sexuality, identity, relationships, and spirituality. If you're seeking a deeper spiritual connection in these areas of your life, we're hoping to be companions on your journey.
Whether you've been hurt by religion and are looking for healing, identify with a faith tradition and are looking outside of the box, identify as spiritual but not religious and want more, or are looking for meaning beyond what is in your life, we believe we can do this together.
Through love, curiosity, and wonder. PolyTheism is a podcast about not just spirituality, but sexuality, which means that we're going to be covering adult topics, and that may include topics that are sensitive to some listeners. If at any time you feel triggered or emotionally overwhelmed because of what we're talking about, please pause the podcast and seek those who love and support you.
And also, though Justin is a professional chaplain, neither of us are professional counselors. So understand that our approach to this is our approach, and that your approach might differ, as well as the approach of other people. By all means, seek out other views on things.
We may get things wrong. We always seek to be inclusive and mindful about anybody who we're engaging. At the same time, we're not going to always get it right. And so please, with a spirit of generosity, let us know if we have gotten something wrong, and we'll seek to make amends.
Remedy. Yeah. This is how we learn.
Hi, Sandra.
Hi, Justin.
Well, this is the first episode of the PolyTheism podcast.
Which, by the way, is a great name. Thank you for coming up with it.
Now, when people think of polytheism, they're probably thinking about religions or spiritualities that include a lot of different gods or goddesses and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So this podcast is a little bit of a play on words.
Well, explain.
Well, you and I are partners in a polyamorous relationship.
We sure are.
And both of us are married to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so hence the poly part. And of course, theism is kind of the exploration of belief and spirituality. That's where we get the word theology. And so because this is a podcast about religion, spirituality, and sexuality and relationships.
Not to mention polyamory and partnerships.
That's right. So hence, polytheism.
That's cute. That's really cute. So in the notes, you say that we want to talk at the beginning about what we mean by spirituality. And you said existential and ontological experience and making meaning.
Yeah.
You want to dig into that a little bit?
Certainly. So I work as a chaplain in a hospital system. And because in the hospital, I encounter everyone from atheists to Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, spiritual and not religious.
Mm-hmm.
People make meaning in a lot of different ways. By existential and ontological searching, the existential piece are the big questions of like, gosh, who am I? What am I doing?
Why am I here? What purpose do I have in this life?
Yeah, where do I come from? Where am I going?
Mm-hmm.
The ontological piece is more comes to the essence of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean that we are creatures in this world? What are beliefs around the place of human beings and the place of life? And so these are the ontological pieces of that spirituality. And so when you put these two together, like, what am I? Who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? Encompasses really just what it means to be human.
Yeah, it's a big, big question. Mm-hmm. And there are just so many different ways of answering that question. Entire wars, entire generations of people have been both raised up and wiped out in relationship to this.
Yeah.
So that's it's a big one. And we're going to tackle it?
We're going to tackle parts of it,
okay.
Or at least to the best of our ability. You know, spirituality also, I think, especially in our culture, when people hear that, sometimes they get a little triggered. Thinking like, oh, spirituality is magical thinking, especially people who may be atheist or agnostic can encounter the word spirituality with a lot of skepticism, which is pretty normal and expected. I think for myself, when I think of spirituality, I think of those transcendental parts of what it means to be human, right? I don't believe I can go and find an atom of compassion or a quark of love. And yet these are pieces of my experience that are intensely gratifying and really help my life be better. And so I believe that these are kind of transcendental parts of the human experience.
Although I really love the idea of a quark of love.
I know. That would be super awesome.
I now want a cake that's called a quark that is of love.
Oh.
I think that would be lovely.
Yeah, the cake is not a lie.
Yeah. See,
how about you?
I approach spirituality a little differently. I was raised in the Bible Belt here in the United States. And there was a lot of fire and brimstone, a lot of God hates you because of your sinfulness and that you have to beg his forgiveness. And it was very oppressive. So rather than approaching it with skepticism, like you were saying, I approach it sometimes with fear. Mm-hmm. And that has been a big part of our relationship, as a matter of fact, is me coming back to a sense of actual spirituality, of actually feeling connected to that part of myself again that I isolated from because I thought there was no place for me there. And this has been a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, and when you're thinking about your spirituality now, what are the things that you do believe?
That is you would think that would be an easy question, but it's so not. Well, let me just put it this way. Let's back up a little bit and talk a little bit about our own spiritual histories. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So my own spiritual history, like I said, I was raised in the Bible Belt. I had wonderful parents who were also Christian, lived that experience, didn't proselytize that experience. So they didn't go door to door knocking, but they lived an experience that I think was a beautiful one. And even though I wanted that, I didn't fit in with it. For one, I lived during the time, so I'm 53. I lived through the Satanic Panic. And the Satanic Panic, I was the kid that played D&D. I was the kid that liked horror novels. I was really seen as somehow evil and wrong. So I kind of got separated from spirituality pretty early on. Mm-hmm. And it made it really hard to think about how I relate to the world, And there was a lot of sadness in that. I didn't realize how much. My real start to return to spirituality came from a 12-step program. Mm-hmm. I worked through a 12-step program. I'm still part of that 12-step program. I think it's really pretty amazing. But one of the things that you have to find in any of these 12-step programs is a higher power. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't take the capital G God. It just wouldn't work for me. And then, is it okay if I tell a tiny little story?
Sure.
Okay,
yeah.
Tiny little story. I went with my husband and his other partner to a Pentatonics concert. And it was beautiful. It was outside. This was like the first thing that we had really done outside after COVID had, really hit. So there was a group of people together and it was beautiful and just so loving and all of this. And they were singing a gorgeous song. I don't even know what it was. And I turned around and I looked all around me. And instead of having lighters in the air, everybody had their phone lights in the air. And so there were all these phone lights swaying together and moving with this song. And I look over and my husband is holding hands with his other partner. And he looks at me and gives me a kiss. And then I look over at this other random guy that I have no idea who he is. And he just smiles at me and he nudges my shoulder. And that little nudge, was connection. Mm-hmm. And I just had this sudden understanding that we are all connected. Yeah. And that the whole is so much more than the sum of the parts. Yeah. That moment was transcendent for me. And so I have a tattoo that says only connect because that's what it's about. Yeah. And so I know if I believe in one thing, it is that connection is what keeps us moving through life and what makes life worthwhile. Yeah. Yeah. So that's my higher power. So that I can say I believe in. Everything else, not sure.
So connection for you is kind of that transcendental spirituality that makes meaning to life.
Yeah.
It's how we were created. We're created as a communal species. that's how we've evolved, and that, so much of our religious and spiritual encounters involve other people, right? Modern day concerts, in many ways, reflect the ancient religious and spiritual traditions involving music and sensory perception and all of these things. And they're just our current iteration, or at least that's what I believe. They're current iterations of this.
Well, that's actually a good way to segue into what do you believe and why do you believe it? Tell us a little about your history.
Oh, gosh. So I was raised Roman Catholic. My father comes from the Mexican Catholic tradition. My mother from kind of a German-Irish settler tradition. And from both of those, of course, came, the saints. It came all the holidays. In Roman Catholicism, there's a lot of ritual. There's a lot of legalistic theology. They have a catechism. And it really, it comes with liturgical seasons. So every single part of the year comes with a meaning and a purpose. And my parents were ones that always believed that you just don't go to church on Sunday to sit in the pews.
Yeah.
Right? They believed that going to church on Sunday meant serving the community. It meant being a part of the life of the church. And so from an early age, my parents took part, whether it was in helping with the Sunday traditions and teaching religious education, having speaking roles during the services. And, as a child, I was an altar server. And so taking part of these rituals and the life of the church in this way really gave me a sense of community, right? The sense that I wasn't alone, that I shared a belief system with others. And in many ways, it was really beautiful because, like what you said, it was about connection. It was about love. It was about, what does it mean to serve? Now, that is, of course, one piece of that puzzle. The other piece, of course, gets to what we're talking about in polytheism as a podcast, which is the sexuality component. I never felt within Christianity or within my Roman Catholicism that I could be anything other than what the Bible or what the religion was teaching. Any kind of thoughts or feelings around queer sexuality or connection, any kind of ideas of sex and sexuality outside of marriage, kind of traditional gender roles, things like that, just were also part of that, and I never felt like that fit. And because of that came a sense of sin and shame and a lot of internalized repression, which, it does kind of that psychological and spiritual damage.
Yeah.
So moving from Roman Catholicism into my 30s, I encountered Unitarian Universalism, which I am an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister now. And in this faith tradition, it's given me permission to break out of the molds of Roman Catholicism and Christianity to really explore, well, what do I believe, right? Whether or not there is a God, a higher power, with a capital G, or that it's male and female, I'm not necessarily convinced of that.
Yeah.
I have experienced kind of what people would call serendipity, right? Or providence, right? Where life seems to come together in a certain way that almost seems like there was something bigger that had a part of that. I also know that this is a very common human experience.
Yeah.
And so whatever label people want to put on that, I've experienced that as kind of intrinsic interconnection of life. That we human beings, as being living organisms in connection with all the other living beings on this planet, we share breath, we share nutrients, we share an ecosystem, and I feel that helps make us, like you said, greater than the sum of the parts. And so my belief in spirituality is that anything that lifts our human beingness into connection, into love, into allowing our emotional and spiritual experience to transcend just our pure biology,
Mm-hmm.
I feel that, yeah, that's what I believe in, is that there is something a little bit more to us being human than just talking meat.
Yeah, you think?
Right.
Oh, okay. Something that I think is really interesting in all of this is how we came to polyamory from very different avenues,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you always had a connection to spirituality, right? Even though as you walked away from the Catholic Church and you moved into spiritual humanism and the Unitarian Universalist faith, you still had that connection. You still always felt that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I felt cut off from that.
Mm-hmm.
Not just because of, the kind of judgment that came with it, but also because I didn't fit any of those molds. The queer thinking was there from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
The being outside of what was considered appropriate was there from the beginning. So I felt cut off from my spirituality, and I found comfort in sexuality and explored that part of myself. And so I moved in a queer society when I was in college, and after college, I started moving with kink communities, and through all of that, I discovered that I was polyamorous, although I didn't know that term for like 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
All the books on polyamory and everything that comes out nowadays, that is just so stunning to me because
it didn't exist.
Yeah, I didn't have it. It's really exciting to see that that is something that is coming there, and meeting you and starting to talk to you. Like first, with my 12-step program, it opened up the possibility
Mm-hmm.
of spirituality again for me. And then meeting you, I saw someone who was inundated with it, who
Mm-hmm.
made it a part of your everyday practice to the point that like your gym practice is a spiritual practice. And that has really opened up the ability for me to come back in touch with my spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And you came the opposite direction, right?
Yeah, I mean, for me, spirituality and kind of a certain amount of religiosity has always been, like you said, a part of my life. And it's been a beautiful and sometimes painful part of my life, and especially when it comes to sexuality and identity and relationships and gender and all of these things. I lived a pretty heteronormative and yet repressed sexuality and identity for most of my life.
Yeah.
Up until, I want to say, into my 40s, right?
Yeah.
I got married when I was 30 and, have had, a few sexual experiences before that. I had a few homosexual experiences before that. But because of the Christianity and a lot of that intrinsic religiosity that was enculturated into me at an early age, a lot of that was repressed. A lot of that came with a deep sense of guilt and shame.
Mm-hmm.
Now, thankfully, from my 30s and into my 40s and embracing a new spiritual and religious tradition like Unitarian Universalism, which doesn't teach about a sinfulness of sexuality. It doesn't teach a sinfulness of relationships or connection or sex, really gave me permission to begin exploring, well, what do I believe about myself? The ontological pieces of my existence, right? I began to understand that I was a lot more queer than I initially had understood. I found a reigniting of my bisexuality. I found a deep connection and drive towards polyamory, as a relationship.
For which I am very thankful.
Yes. And in many ways, I am so new to these, I think what our culture would say, kind of the coming out experience, which, I've seen so many young people now, and I think a lot of that is because of my church and because of where we live in the Pacific Northwest, that young people can come out now and be true to themselves in a way that we never had access to in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. Like, so you always had this comfort in like going to church and walking into spiritual places. Whereas like I, growing up, learned to love drag bars and kink parties and dungeons and, sex positive spaces because they allowed me the freedom that I think that you might have felt and the connection that you might have felt in church,
Yeah.
you know? So very different way of approaching kind of the same thing. And this is why we made it polytheism, is because the two are inextricably intertwined.
Yeah.
No matter how people approach it and no matter why people approach it that way, the spiritual and the sexual sides of ourselves are interconnected. And there's no way to truly separate those two. And one of the things that we have certainly found together is that including one with the other is a beautiful way of becoming more whole.
Yeah. Yeah, in our Western culture and society, a lot of these things have been split apart, right? I feel that in the Western tradition, there's been this idea of our mind and our intellect being a very separate part of our physical bodies. If spirituality exists, at least within the Christian tradition, but maybe in other traditions as well, there's this idea that the spirit is separate from the incarnate flesh. And yet what I have learned and experienced, especially in my chaplaincy and ministry in the hospital, is that these are all interconnected, interrelated parts of what it means to be human. The spiritual is sexual. The spiritual is physical. The spiritual is mental and emotional. And they all exist all at the same time.
And I think we're seeing the world come around to that a little bit. I mean, you mentioned earlier that you're bisexual. I would also call myself bisexual, but I realize that term is a term that I hold on to very specifically because I had to fight for it. You know, when I started college, there were gay and lesbian groups, and I went to those groups, and they told me to figure it out and then come back. So, you know, being bisexual was, and you can't see it, but I did air quotes, being bisexual was not accepted for a long time. There's still a lot of bisexual erasure that happens out there. Just think about, oh God, the lead singer of Queen. What?
Freddie Mercury.
Freddie Mercury, right? Like the recent movie that they made about him, like really was like, they said, oh, well, he's gay. Actually, no, he really liked having sex with women too.
Yeah.
You know, but now we have terms like pansexual and omnisexual that are not a binary, that are not a separation, but somewhere in between. And I find that deeply meaningful.
It's amazing, right? I think in this time and place where people are really looking at their gender and their identities and their sexualities, they are digging into those existential and ontological parts of what it means to be them or means to be me. That's why we have all these terms, you know, whether it's asexual or demisexual or pansexual. I mean, it can sometimes be really overwhelming for people for whom probably are a little more heteronormative, who are a little more cisgendered. It probably seems really overwhelming and really, really confusing. And yet, I believe all this is people breaking outside of boxes that were artificial. Right? And their experience transcended those boxes, and the boxes had to break.
I heard you give this description of spirituality as a box in another conversation that you had with some sex educators. It was so good. Do you think you could summarize that?
Yeah, and this will help the podcast too. So the difference between religion and spirituality. So it's my belief that all human beings are spiritual, regardless of kind of what the beliefs are, whether or not we are deists, so believe in a God, we believe in nature, we believe in connection, that these intrinsic searches of existential and ontological experience and meaning, that's the spirituality. Religion are the boxes that we try to make sense of our spirituality in, which, you know, come with all things that come with boxes, which it's created. It has barriers, it has boundaries, it also has, there's some security in feeling that there is a foundation and that being held by something that makes sense in a universe that is way too big and way too mysterious that it can blow somebody's mind. And so our spirituality can sometimes fit really nicely in a religious box. And for some people, our spirituality continues to grow, continues to shape, and can sometimes overflow the box. And so I either had to make a choice of stifling my spirituality so it would fit in the box, or recognizing that really what I needed was a bigger box.
Yeah.
And so that helps me define my movement from Roman Catholicism to Unitarian Universalism. Is I found a box, I found a religious system that was big enough for my spirituality, that also encouraged me to grow my spirituality. And the box was big enough to hold that, at least up to this point.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, because like by the time I went to college, I was like, fuck this box. I threw it over my shoulder. I'm not getting anywhere near that box, you know? And I have like slowly come back to say, you know what? I do have a form here. There is a form to my belief.
Yeah.
There is an understanding to my belief. And I've come to it, interestingly enough, through learning. So you know that I went to all but dissertation. I studied language, I studied literature, stories, making meaning.
Yeah.
You know, just in a different way. And you know, so much of what I have seen about the flow of our understanding of language and our understanding of meaning in language is following that same pattern that we're seeing with sexuality and with spirituality, is that it hits the edges of a box and then it goes, you know what, that can't work anymore. We've got to either explode the box, or we've got to set the sides down or something. We got to reshape it. Yeah. I mean, all of this is, again, intertwined.
Yeah. And so a lot of these, like both you and I, kind of sharing our stories and setting a foundation for the podcast. This is why we want to do the podcast, because recognizing in this time and space with a lot of podcasts and a lot of information about polyamory and religion and spirituality, you have a big movement in kind of Christian deconstructionism and postmodernism, that, you know, there's a lot of information out there, and I haven't been able to find a podcast that spoke to this intersection of sexuality, gender, identity, relationship, and spirituality.
Yeah.
And so I kind of felt that it would be really fun to give a shot.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of stuff out there about how to do things and about even how to think about things and how to approach them. There's some great podcasts out there. You know, the two that we listen to the most often is Making Polyamory Work and Multiamory. But there are a lot of others that are really great in giving ideas of how to approach this and concepts of how you can make a poly relationship work, or a relationship that is not normative, right? Notice I don't say normal because I don't believe in normal, but not normative. So many things about how to do stuff, but there's not a lot of thinking about why. Why do we feel the need to, like, why do we feel like we are a they? Why do we feel like we are poly? Why do we feel like we're pansexual or omnisexual or, you know, just queer? You know, why are these things that become such a fundamental part of how we feel about ourselves? And that's what I think we're trying to do here, right?
Yeah, we're trying to put the why, right?
Yeah.
And by talking about the why, hopefully other people who can encounter our podcast can start asking the why also.
We're putting the Y in poly?
We're putting the Y in poly. Yes, I love that.
I'm sorry, I couldn't help.
And so looking into the future for the podcast, what are some things you're hoping for?
Well, I think what I am really hoping to be able to do is to look at a lot of both spiritual practices and sexual practices where we can see the intersection between the two. And there's just so many out there. There are some incredible books about the intersection between kink and spirituality. There are, you know, tantric practices. I'm sure you can think of half a dozen others. Feel free to list them.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to sexuality, I mean, for every identity that people have, whether you're asexual, demisexual, pansexual, whatever part of the spectrum any of us fall into, each person can tap into, well, what is it that they love about those identities? There may be part of those identities that hurt, right? There may be part of those identities that still are a struggle. And part of our existential and ontological search for meaning sometimes involves struggling to make sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, we've even had deep and personal conversations in which I cried about finding these wounds that I didn't know existed, that I had sealed off from myself because I thought I could never have it.
Yeah.
Like I was just too weird.
Yeah.
You know?
And that brings up, earlier today, you had told me a story, kind of the first time that you kind of began to reject the notion of God and spirituality. You said you were 12.
I was 12. Oh, gosh. Yeah, so, again, growing up in the Bible Belt, I was very shielded in a lot of ways when I was younger from some of the more hellfire and brimstone things from my parents. My parents were very good, and I actually had a preacher in the Methodist church that we went to that was incredible and, like, encouraged me to learn, not just in this religion, but in other religions. And then when he moved on, in Methodist practice, they move pastors around every few years. When he moved on and we had another person come in, he was very, very into the satanic panic, let's just say. You know, rock and roll was evil and horror movies are evil and all of this. Sex was evil and like all of these evil things and everybody's falling apart. And there's a lot of hellfire and brimstone talk. Yeah. To try to get away from that, I would go to some of my friends' churches. Unfortunately, those churches were Southern Baptist.
Okay.
And that did not help. And, you know, I remember when I was 12 years old and I was in my bed and I was crying. Yeah. I was asking God to forgive me for all the sins that I knew I had done that day. And then I was absolutely sure that I didn't know all of them. So I begged for forgiveness for all those things that I didn't even know were a sin that I had done. And a part of me went, what is this? Yeah. This does not feel like love. And that's when I stopped praying.
Yeah. It breaks my heart that a 12-year-old would be worrying about something like that. Worrying about sins that they didn't even know were sins, right? Yeah. And I feel that that's one other thing that I want this podcast to be about is how do we heal some of these wounds that have happened to us, that have happened to me and you and to others in the name of religion and spirituality, and understanding that these were human wounds. These wounds came from people, and that there is, at least I believe, that there is no fundamental wrongness to being human.
Yeah, right. And that's very different from our Western world norm.
Exactly.
You know, right. It was a counselor up here in the Pacific Northwest. I moved from Texas, you know. As a counselor here in the Pacific Northwest who taught me the term spiritual abuse. Never heard of it before. I mean, I did a triple take. I was like, what? This is a thing? I just thought I was bad. Yeah.
Well, you weren't.
Yeah.
Nobody is, right? In the Unitarian Universalist tradition, we have a saying. I would call it a belief, but it's more of a saying, that every human being is more than the worst thing we have ever done in our entire lives.
That is straight out of the 12-step book.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I mean, that is one of the foundations of 12-step practices is that, we have been in a really bad place. One of the things that we say is like, we will not shut the door on our past nor wish to forget about it. Yeah. You know, like, we're going to be proud of what we have done and what we have accomplished and what we have gone through because it's going to help someone else at some point. And that is forgiveness. That's what I was begging God for. Yeah. Right? And that I found outside of it. Yeah.
And sounds like you found some of that healing and some of that forgiveness in 12-step spirituality.
Yeah. Right. And in finding out that I can do that myself. I don't have to look to something else outside of me to forgive me for being me. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think one of the intrinsic and probably one of the most important pieces of 12-step spirituality, and this goes back to what you were saying before, is you don't do it alone.
Yeah. You can't. You can't. There is no way to do it alone because you can't make meaning out of something you don't know.
Yeah.
Right? There's, I think what the way that they say it is like the consciousness that created the problem can't solve it. You know? So, and you don't know how to have another conscious until you have an existential crisis that says, I gotta change this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's where 12 step comes from, is people get to a point that they're so low, they're like, I can't live like this anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think especially now, since, we're still experiencing COVID, but we're post-quarantine, as a culture and society, we're still figuring out, how will we be together, right, in this world? And in many ways, some of the old forms of being together have been broken. And we're starting to put them back together, right? And during COVID, during lockdown, a lot of people stopped going to church. A lot of people stopped going to AA meetings. A lot of people couldn't gather in these ways. And we're starting to find people looking for community in ways that I would say are intrinsic to what we would call church or spiritual communities, right? And that these communities are also looking at sexuality and gender and identity and relationships differently.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these communities are starting to acknowledge that, unfortunately, a lot of people have been left behind.
Yeah.
And we need to bring people back into connection.
Yeah.
And I hope that that's what we do with this podcast.
Yeah, I was about to loop it back to the podcast. Exactly. This is what we're hoping to do. The episodes are going to be about things related to sexuality and spirituality. So, for example, talking about ways in which spirituality and sexuality intersect, maybe talking about healing those sexual, spiritual wounds. We want to bring on an authority on kink and spirituality. Yep. Maybe talk to somebody about their trans experience
or people
sexuality.
or people who are asexual, or bring in a young person to talk about, their experiences as being queer and spiritual now versus, when we were growing up.
Yeah.
Or maybe even bring in an elder queer to talk about, their spirituality and sexuality intersection when they were coming of age, whether it was back in the 60s or 70s.
Yeah, we're really blessed to know like a diverse group of people, that just practice their principles in a lot of different ways. And I can't wait to get some of them on to talk about their own experiences. And I hope that those will help you find community where you can talk about your experiences, find people who share, and just not feel alone in feeling all of these things. Because I spent decades feeling alone. It's hard.
Yeah. I believe that spirituality is one of the most important parts of being human, that allows us to feel interconnected even when we don't have human contact, right?
Yeah.
It's this idea that even if I'm in the middle of a forest, completely alone and isolated, that in actuality I am not alone, because there will always be a way of coming home. There will always be a way of looking up into the sky and knowing that I am surrounded by life.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so allowing people to find a little bit of healing through this podcast, maybe wrestle with some of the big questions that they're asking. And maybe both you and I will find something new and evolve our own beliefs and our own experiences.
I think we have to. I mean, you and I both feel like lifelong learning is essential to continuing to be a human being. So as we bring people on, as we talk to them, I'm sure we'll know. And hopefully you'll talk to us too. Yeah. And we'll learn from you.
Yeah.
Because no one's really an expert on any of this stuff.
No.
We're all just people.
Yeah. And for you and I, like you said at the beginning, neither of us are therapists, right? We're not professionals when it comes to kind of the traditional psychological healing modalities that we have. What we do have are our experiences. We have our education. We have what we are good at. And we want this podcast to be an offering to others of just sharing And so we invite people who are listening to us to connect with us. How you can connect with us via email or via social media. Our email is polytheismpodcast@gmail.com. You could probably find us on Facebook and Instagram. There will be more social media that we add a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
And let us know what you want to talk about.
Yeah, we would love to get ideas from you. We have a few lined up for our first ones, but boy, I would love to hear what other people would want to talk about.
Yeah, and while listening to us, if you have questions, if you have things that you inherently disagree with, if you have ideas and things that we didn't bring up that you're like, wait, I need you to talk to this, just let us know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also recognize that with all things involving internet, there's always going to be haters.
Oh,
and
there's
that's
always
okay.
trolls.
Yeah, and that's okay too, because it's all part of the learning process. And if you are listening to this and are feeling a deep sense of anger or sadness or hate or any of these emotions, let us know too. What I hope is that we can both offer just compassion and acknowledge that, yeah, these can be really painful topics and they can be really challenging.
I think that's a great place to stop today.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think you're right.
Yeah.
And so for those of you who are listening, thank you for joining us for this first ever episode of PolyTheism Podcast.
And please come back and listen to the next one.
Yeah, so I'm Justin.
I'm Sandra.
And please take care and may peace be with you.
And remember, self-care is sexy.